My name is Michael Kibbe. I am the academic dean and associate professor of Bible at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington.
Dr. Michael Kibbe. Mike, good to see you. Welcome to Exegetically Speaking for the very first time.
Thank you for having me on.
It's great to see you. Great to see you. So, how did you get started reading Greek?
I started taking Greek my sophomore year of college. I was a student in the Biblical Studies program at Cedarville University in Ohio.
Yeah.
And Dr. Greg Kauser, New Testament scholar, was my Greek professor there. And so I read through Bill Mounce's book, as most of us did at that stage, and then took some
Yes.
courses on syntax and exegesis and so forth. And now I get to teach Greek. And
Uh,
there's a lot of extra learning in between those two things, but that was where it all started for me.
was it easy for you to get started, or did you have to really work at it hard?
Oh no, I was Noah's shining exemplar of a Greek student for those first couple of years. I
Oh,
made it, I got through it. But I might say, probably like a lot of people, I came into Greek thinking, yay, now I'm going to find the answers to all my questions.
ah, hmm,
And once I got into Greek, I realized it doesn't answer all my questions, but what it does is clarify which questions are worth asking.
hmm, hmm.
So I still have questions, but I think they're better questions now than they used to be because of the use of biblical languages in the process.
Yeah, and it opens up the world of Scripture in a way that nothing quite can, right? So,
Mhm.
so you're at Great Northern University, and
Yes.
that's in Spokane. So, tell us a little bit about that for those who don't know about it.
Yeah, Great Northern University started in 2018. So we
Oh,
are
it's pretty new
very
then.
much a newcomer to the higher education scene, but there was a group of us there who had a vision for a Christian liberal arts university in Spokane. We are very small. We have a lot of priority on building relationships with our students. We have realized in the last few years that people have a lot of pain points about college. The higher education scene is very complex right now. There are a
Yeah,
lot of
it
good
is.
schools doing a lot of good things, and yet there are a lot of people wondering why and how and what's the point and how do I pay for it and so forth. So, what we've tried to build is a school that brings together biblical fidelity with a lot of practical, hands-on, on-the-job kind of training,
Hmm.
and yet staying affordable. So those tend to be the spaces we operate in. We are a small school where we get a lot of face time with our faculty and our students. We have students in our home on a regular basis, and
That's cool.
students get to graduate knowing the people that they've been with the last 4 years.
Hmm. Hmm. That is a huge advantage these days and times over a school where you walk into an auditorium and have a course in introduction to psychology with 300 people, right? And
Yes, we do not have any classes with 300 people. I promise you
yeah,
that.
no, that's great. Well, we wish you well there. Anything
Thank
new
you.
in higher education right now, it's just a lot of things are shrinking. A lot of schools are shrinking, and others like yourself. I mean, what you've done is you've said, let's imagine something here in Spokane that can be great and can be kingdom directed, and that's fantastic. Hey, today we're going to
Thank
talk
you.
about Mark chapter 1 when we turn to Greek. And you got some really interesting stuff to talk about today. What's going on in Mark chapter 1 that's interesting for you?
Yeah. Oh, boy, there are so many things going on in Mark chapter 1 that are interesting. Uh, the thing that I find particularly fascinating is something having to do with how the biblical languages work and how the narrative flows.
Hmm.
So, one of the things that every first year Greek student's going to get to at some point is they find out that Greek can tell a story using several different verb tenses.
Hmm.
So, the language we have for those are the perfect, the imperfect, and the aorist.
Mm-hmm.
And stories are primarily told using the aorist and the imperfect. Now, the difference between those two in English often comes out to something like a past completed action, something happened, that's usually an aorist,
Mm-hmm.
versus a past progressive action, something was happening, that's usually an imperfect.
Hmm.
So to some degree, you can look at your English Bible and see happened versus was happening, and guess that there's an aorist or an imperfect there. And it isn't a one-to-one correspondence. Languages don't tend to work that way. It's a little bit more involved than that. But the way these play out in Greek is one of these verb tenses serves to tell a story. The aorist tense is the one that a Greek narrator is going to use to say, let me show you the main storyline. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, all the way through.
Mm.
And then the imperfect tense is the one that a narrator is going to use to say, okay, we're gonna pause for a second, and we're still in the moment in terms of the story flowing. We haven't gone forward, but within this moment, there are some other things going on along the sideline or behind the scenes. Or by the way, here's a thing that's been happening all along that you weren't aware of yet, but it isn't the main storyline. It's a current along the main storyline.
Hmm.
And the Greek narrator will use the imperfect tense to show that. And so
I
something
see.
that you can do is look at a Greek storyline, and this is something we'll do in my various classes, is we'll just print out a copy of a Greek story and just go through and circle all the aorist, what's called an aorist indicative. It's that this thing happened, parts of the narrative.
And this is the thing that
And by
moves the story along.
yeah,
Right.
this is
Right.
the thing that moves the story along. So
Right.
you can look at just isolate those for a minute, and you can get a pretty good sense of what the storyteller wants you to see as the primary events as the story unfolds.
Hmm.
And so, for example, in Mark chapter 1, we have a little bit of introductory material. This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Then there's a quote that's from Isaiah with a little bit of Exodus thrown in.
Hmm.
And then we get the beginning of the actual story in chapter 1, verse 4, where it says that John the Baptist happened.
Hmm.
He appeared, he arrived, Egeneto, on the scene, and that's an aorist. So now I'm being told as a reader, the story has begun. And this is the first event in that story.
That John has appeared
Now,
in the
that
desert here.
John has appeared.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's the first step.
Hmm.
But then over the next 5 verses or so, there are in English a lot of things happening that John does, but none of them are aorist indicatives. They're all imperfect indicatives, which means we're sitting in this first moment of the story, but coloring in the sides a little bit.
Yeah, I like that. You're coloring in the different colors. John is the guy
Yeah.
who was baptizing. He was the guy who was uh, for whom people were all going out to see him, right? And
Yeah.
he was
Yep.
wearing these clothes and he was eating
He's
this diet. All of that is
Mhm.
told. It's not doesn't really move the story along. It just tells you. It sort of identifies who John is in the story.
Mhm. So if you were making a movie out of this scene, the camera wouldn't have gone anywhere. It would have seen John, and then you might have zoomed in on John a little bit.
Yeah.
And you would have seen his clothing. You would have seen people coming his way. You would have heard him talking, but we wouldn't move the camera forward. It's just there because there's only been one aorist to tell us what to do.
Hmm.
And then the very next aorist comes in verse 9. And it's the same verb that you have back in verse 4, except this time it's not John showing up, it's Jesus showing up.
Ah, yes.
And so the first moment in the story is John showed up. We're looking at him on screen, and there's a bunch of details around that. The next moment is, oh, now we're going to shift the camera because the next scene is happening and it's Jesus showing up. But now the verb tenses are going to change on us a little bit
Hmm.
because it's going to describe Jesus, but it's not going to use imperfects. It's going to use aorists. And so what's happening is Jesus doesn't show up or doesn't just show up in verse 9. He
Hmm.
also comes. We have a movement aorist indicative.
Comes
And then
from
he is
Nazareth of
baptized,
Galilee, right? Yeah.
comes from Nazareth in Galilee.
Yeah.
And then he was baptized. And that's an aorist.
Hmm.
That's the next moment in the story. And then he sees heaven being torn open in verse 10. And that's an aorist. And that's the next moment in the story.
Hmm.
And then in verse 11, we have the same verb that we've seen twice already in verses 4 and 9 happen again. And there's a voice that happens.
Hmm.
And so what that does, one of my favorite authors is John Grisham. He writes legal fiction and these sorts of
Oh
things. He's a great
yeah. Oh
author, but
yeah.
I read once that John Grisham varies his tempo between fast and breakneck. It just
Yes,
a
two
John
speeds.
Grisham
Yeah.
movie, it just never stops. It never slows down. When you get a whole clump of aorists in 2 verses, we're getting into John Grisham pace here. We are moving this story along because stuff is happening. We didn't get that with John the Baptist, but we did get that when Jesus came on the scene. This thing is really rolling now.
Well, it's really interesting how you can just look at the aspect, or what we used to call the tense of
The
the
tense,
verb,
right?
is sort of a marker
Mm-hmm.
in, a discourse marker, if you would, for what's happening in the story and what our storyteller is trying to get us to focus on. Really interesting stuff,
Yeah.
Mike. Gosh.
Yeah. I think there's that prioritization piece. So
Hmm.
part of it is saying, each of the four gospels tells you about John the Baptist, and each in their own way tells you that Jesus is more important than John the Baptist.
Yes.
And this is part of how Mark is going to do that,
Hmm.
because he's simply going to give you more action, more movement, more momentum, higher speed of the narrative when you look at Jesus. And that's part of his way of saying, hey, the story really moves when Jesus comes on the scene.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
other gospel writers have other ways of doing that. But that's
Right.
part of Mark's way of making you feel oh, this guy's here now. This is the thing we're on about.
This is this is the main act of the
Mhm.
story.
This is the main event.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Dr. Michael Kibbe, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking. Hope you'll come back.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure to be here. I appreciate the time.
Now, if you heard some construction noise during this podcast, that was on purpose to remind you that we're still building here in Houston at the Lanier Theological Library. Thanks to Dr. Michael Kibbe for being with us today. I think Great Northern University in Spokane is in good hands with him at the academic helm. Thanks to Ian Rosine, Jesse Dugan, Rebecca Larson, and John Lansma for their help in producing this podcast. They're such great partners. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Isn't it time for you to enroll in Wheaton College and start studying biblical languages? It's never too late to start. There's information on how to get started in the show notes. You will not regret it. More great insights from our scholars are coming your way next week. I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.